Hello there, good to have your company again. From Michael Jackson to R. Kelly, celebrity crime or allegations of it have made for compelling viewing in recent documentaries. But the content is, of course, tightly edited and we don't always get the full picture. There isn't time for it. So is it fair to conduct what is essentially trial by television? You're watching Roundtable. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. They are carefully produced stories that have entertained millions of viewers, but documentaries do deal with real people and real evidence, it is hoped, and recent films are threatening to have a lasting effect on perhaps the reputations of two of the world's most famous musicians.
Some documentaries get more attention than others, especially those seeking to expose someone's innocence or guilt.
It wasn't just me that was young that he liked.
Surviving R. Kelly pulled in a massive viewership when it aired in January. In its wake, it has prompted investigations, and the singer has now been charged with 10 counts of aggravated sexual abuse in Chicago, though he denies all allegations. Just over a month later, another star was the target. In Leaving Neverland, two men say Michael Jackson was a paedophile who groomed and abused them as children. The film has divided public opinion. Many are convinced, others still skeptical, while Jackson's fans and family continue to protest his innocence.
Well, joining me at the round table, we have Oliver Fetiveau, a commercial lawyer who focuses on intellectual property, libel and image rights. Joe Smith here too, filmmaker at The Economist, who's formerly worked on Dispatches. Caroline Frost with us too, arts and entertainment journalist and television chair for the Broadcasting Press Guild. And Jez Lewis here as well, director and producer who co-founded the Bungalow Town production company. Hey, great to have you all with us here. We were talking about, or we heard just there about the Michael Jackson film, and his estate is suing the production company for $100 million. That's what they'd like to get. And the guy representing him has told a news website that HBO should have ensured that Leaving Neverland was properly sourced, fact-checked, and a fair and balanced representation. Fact-checking. It is almost impossible to be certain that you've got it right, isn't it?
Well, in the instances of Michael Jackson, where he's dead and everything that's alleged took place behind closed doors, yeah, those facts are impossible to check, I would say.
And what about when you come to make a documentary? How certain can you be?
Well, if we're putting something forward as fact, we have to be certain. We have to go through a rigorous fact-checking. And invariably, there is a broadcaster like HBO, or for us, usually BBC, and they're strict on those things. If it's something to do with credibility, then it's a bit more of a grey area where it's up to the audience really to judge how credible they find the contributor.
You see, they are strict in that they want things to be right, but how can they be strict in ensuring that they're right? My question is, how can you be certain?
I mean, I think with facts and checking, you know, you have to do your research, you have to do your background first of all, and when you're looking at contributors, you have to interrogate them as you would before they go in front of camera. I mean, I think there's a lot of work that's done behind the scenes before you press record, and then afterwards as well. That, you know, a lot of the filmmaking that the audience don't see. They only see the hour or 4 hours in this instance of what was made, but there would have been a hell of a lot of work done beforehand and afterwards to make sure that it's rigorously fact-checked.
When it comes to fact-checking, these days there is so much fake, I won't call it fake news, there's so much rubbish out there,
yeah,
that you can't be certain, can you, all the time?
No, but I mean, I think you have to, you know, at the first instance, you're a journalist, and, you know, there's a moral responsibility as a journalist to make sure that you're as rigorous as you can be. And therefore, you make sure that you try, you know, in the best intentions, go for the facts. Truth
can be boring, though, can't it? Isn't it sort of sometimes sort of jazzed up a bit to make it more watchable?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that you know, I mean, I think with the instance of the Michael Jackson piece, especially, you know, this was made. You know, there was a very light editorial touch in terms of what was said, aside from the testimonies of the two men that were in the film. And you know, I think that journalistically, you know, they would have had to have gone for a right to reply. I understand that they did go to the estate for a right to reply.
It depends who you believe in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll come to you in just a moment if I went on the legal ramifications of something like this. But what we're seeing, perhaps, Caroline, both of you on this one, what we're seeing here, not with these two, but what we're seeing in the instances that we've cited, is trial by television.
Yes, it is. And it's all the more entertaining for the drama of the revelations. They've been memorable, they've been headline catching around the world. And I'm very impressed by the integrity of both of you as filmmakers, the fact that you go to those lengths. But there will be other far more cynical filmmakers making similar material and just going for those headlines, going for the commercials, the sponsorship, all the riches that come with it. And I think it takes a quite strictly self-disciplined and self-controlling person to steer back towards the rigours that you're both describing, and I'm not sure everybody is prepared to do that.
You see, I think back to the dim and distant past when I first decided I wanted to be a journalist, and I don't want to sound sanctimonious here, but I thought there's absolutely no point in going into this if you don't want to try and tell the truth. Now, I know journalists in the course of a rather long career who have deliberately not told the truth. And again, I don't want to be sanctimonious, but most people do, don't they?
Well, you know, you got to think.
Sorry, Ollie, I'm not leaving you out.
Sorry, you got to think. You know, I think as a journalist, if you're taking that risk, if you're not following the truth, I think your career will be pretty short. You know, and if it isn't, you're always walking that tightrope of being found out, someone making a counter allegation, and in that case, you know. Your credibility is key, right? I mean, if you know, with the example of Dan Reed, you know, he's made several films. The director of the Michael Jackson piece. Yeah. You know, he's made loads of films. He's had a long, illustrious career, and you know, he's built a reputation based on making things that haven't, you know, that have been journalistically sound. Yeah. And if you're then, you know, and you'd like to think that he would continue to do so, and I think that if you're going to push the boundaries, you know, there are always times when you're in the edit or when you're making, you know, in the process where you could quite easily go down one route and not interrogate the facts as hard as maybe you should. But if you do that, you're going to get found out. You know, I mean.
Well, I do know a story about one person who was found out by his employer, who then said it's going to be too embarrassing for us to let it. Or to say that he's actually lied about this and put together this rubbish story and went and got an award. I might tell that story a bit later on. But Ollie, in this situation, let's say either Jez or Joe comes to you, or they're the commissioning broadcaster comes to you and says, we want you to take a look at this. How do you examine what they're saying objectively? Is it simply from a legal point of view, we don't want to get in trouble with this?
I think you've got to counterbalance the commercial interests in telling the story as the filmmakers see it, as against the legal risk of proceeding with what might be a safer programme. The instance of the Michael Jackson programme is particularly interesting for the reason I see the original 2005 trial relied on testimony from Wade Robson. And it was heavily weighed upon by... Just
for our viewers, who's who in this?
Wade Robson is one of the two people who's the subject of the Leaving Neverland documentary. And his testimony, he was the first witness for the defence. And they heavily relied upon him standing up saying, Michael Jackson never abused me. And I think under those circumstances, considering many thought that was basically what might have got him off first time round, under those circumstances, it's interesting that Dan Reed took the decision not to interview the two people, Brett Barnes and Macaulay Culkin. And he said before production, he said there was one comment, he said he didn't think it was his job to, and he used the words, out them. And I found that very interesting because it suggests he already had a preconception as to the fact that they had been abused, despite having never interviewed them at all. So this plays in with the idea, and I'd be very interested to know what Jez and Joe think about this. But if you're a documentary filmmaker and you have a preconceived narrative, how much do you stick to that preconceived narrative to get to the the story.
Because that's why you've been hired to do it in the first place, perhaps.
Possibly, you might have got the commission on the basis of a pretty hefty sales pitch. This happened, and we're going to we can reveal this, and then when you come up against something that actually takes you off that path, I think documentary makers, and you'll know better than I, but probably have a difficult decision to take in terms of, well, do we go that way? I mean, or do we stick to our guns and tell the story that we always wanted to tell?
So you're talking now not necessarily from a legal perspective, but from just an interested party perspective. What is the legal perspective? How do you make damn sure that these guys are telling the truth from a legal point of view?
Well, I mean, it's the test is you look at the program that they're making, and you ascertain what the defamatory meaning of that program is. If there's a libel risk, for example, you say, well, that program as it stands says this about that person or about that company. What do you have to back up that allegation? So it's quite a meticulous, you work out what it actually means, and then you ask them to substantiate it. And sometimes that will be by documentary evidence, and sometimes it will be by other
Is that not a
witnesses.
little bit like sort of being in the middle of a war zone, and when you come back to do your expenses, they say, where's your receipt? It's not always possible to get documentation in the circumstances in which you're interviewing people. I mean, I know you talked about rape victims. Well, they're not going to give you anything written, are they?
Well, I would come back to the comparison of a trial. And I used to work in the criminal courts for a few years as a legal clerk. And I would work alongside the barristers. We were defence team. And we would have our client. And our client would tell us stuff, but would never incriminate themselves. If the the defendant incriminated themselves, the barrister would have to stand up and say, I'm embarrassed. I can't really continue with this case. But all the time, you know you're not getting full disclosure. And it's an adversarial system in our criminal courts. So your counsel, you're representing your client, even though you can't hand on heart say, I know this person to be entirely innocent of all charges made against them. Similarly, the prosecution is enacting a belief that that person is guilty, but they're representing the case.
Sorry to push you, but how does this apply to what we're talking about here, in documentaries?
Because I think that to a certain extent, well, firstly, I would say it's not trial by television. I disagree that it's trial by television because there is not two sides. There's only one side in for example, the Neverland film. But secondly, that as a filmmaker, you're continually making judgments as to the credibility of the person you have in front of you. And you may have two witnesses to the same event telling you two slightly or even significantly different versions, and they may both believe it. And in the courts, a judge would be there to say to the jury, you may hear these two different versions of events, you may feel that both people are trying to be honest, or perhaps that they're not. And if they're not being honest, they may have several reasons for not being honest that may not be to do with protecting the defendant.
So are you a little bit worried about what you're seeing now? A genre in which there is not only no judge, but the person making the documentary could effectively be judge, jury and executioner?
Yeah, in effect, because a judge plays a big role in a trial, which is partly guiding the jury, who are a lay audience, in effect, who are then required to make a guilty or not guilty verdict. But the judge will give quite strong direction throughout that as to what's appropriate, and sometimes they'll clear the court and remove the jury, and the lawyers will have a conversation that the jury are not privy to. I'm
going to ask you a couple of questions in just a moment. Sorry, but I wanted to ask Caroline this. Why do you think we are now seeing more of the type of documentaries that Jez is perhaps a bit worried about that has led us to this conversation?
I completely support his metaphor for the courtroom. I'm reminded of the OJ trial, and of course the defence had the great
OJ Simpson.
Yes,
yeah.
if the glove doesn't fit, we must acquit. The prosecution had nothing so dramatic, nothing so powerful, nothing so memorable. And I think the jury, as TV audiences, were at the whim of our attention spans, of our emotions. That stuck in the jury's ears. That was described as this amazing sort of turning point of that trial. And I think similarly, when we see these films, it is those faces and the entertainment factor will define what the conclusion is. But as to why we're seeing so many more, I think filmmaking has become a lot more accessible to many. I mean, while you have the big juggernauts of HBO, the Neverland film, we also have a lot of guerrilla filmmaking, And people, I think, are finding their voices.
Not in the David Attenborough sense. You mean as in
yes,
anybody out there with a camera who is
with a phone, anything you want, and
guerrilla
recorder.
fighter filmmaker. Yeah.
Yes, but with that brings, and what propels people who are making no money from documentaries is emotion, crusading, and having something that they.
This
think
is
they
rather
can
like
say.
my feelings about citizen journalism, isn't it? I mean, we aren't saints in the journalism business, but we have a lot of experience in it. And suddenly you find what are called citizen journalists going out there and perhaps affecting the reputation, because what they're saying cannot necessarily be trusted, affecting the reputation of the broader industry.
But the thing is with that kind of element, you know, you've still got your reputable outlets, right? And to be working for a reputable outlet, you need to have a level of, you have a level of responsibility to be a good journalist, to maintain their kind of reputation. And so if you're working for, you know, a big news outlet that's got a history of kind of, you know, reporting the truth or being trustworthy, then that's slightly different, I think. And then you have to make sure that you interrogate the facts. You have to make sure that you're trying to get to the truth. You spoke earlier about the rape films. I made those, and it was 3 short films where victims of rape waived their anonymity, you know, what I made a conscious decision to do in that was, this is well after the fact. You know, not all of the cases went to court, as a lot of rape. You know, allegations and rape victims don't always manage to get to court. And so with those, we made sure that we told the personal stories of the impact that had on those individuals. And with you know, an instance like that, they're so, you know, it's such a subject that's so personal to that individual, but also, you know, is really important that people know about these things. And I think that with those films, we made sure that we interrogated the contributors as much as we could beforehand, but we also made sure that they had the support.
Did you not give them an easy time because you were a bit sorry for them?
No, because I think that you have to ask the hard questions. I mean, I think that it's part of your, you know, you have a responsibility to do that. Otherwise, you're not giving them the opportunity to air the whole sides of their story as well. So I think that I think that you don't let them.
But do you agree with Jez on this, that we are seeing more of this type of I don't know what it is, exploitative documentary, if you like, over-egged, beaten up, as in made much more of?
I think if you
there exists.
I think with the Michael Jackson films especially, I think there's because of his celebrity, it's had a huge furore across the world. There's been a huge ripple effect. But actually, in terms of filmmaking, there were quite a lot of decisions that were made in that were relatively light touch. You know, so there was 2 testimonials from 2 victims, and what the director said was that these films were about these 2 individuals, not about Michael Jackson, right?
Well, but we know that was nonsense.
But what I'm saying is, in between those interviews, you had you know, a lot of the shots selection, very little archive, and so, you know, there was quite light touch editorial pieces apart from the interviews themselves, the testimony of the individuals, and that, you know, in a way you can understand. I think personally you can understand why they did that.
There have been instances where documentaries have been made around a trial. And for example, when I worked in criminal law, I worked for the company that did the Guildford 4 miscarriage of justice appeal. And there were a couple of documentaries made before the appeal was successful, during the period that they were all in jail. And these documentaries called into question the validity of the convictions, considered them unsafe. Sure enough, it turned out that they were unsafe. The appeals eventually succeeded, and these guys who'd spent decades in jail unjustly were released. And I think one has to look at that example and say, there are examples that we have concerns about, as we've kind of suggested, and there are examples where we must feel like this, Errol Morris's The Thin Blue Line, for example, where we must feel that was the right thing to do.
Ollie, we're not leaving you out of this, because I just wanted to come to you from a legal point of view, you cannot libel the dead, can you? Is that a worldwide thing, or is that just
Yeah,
this country?
I mean, I'm a UK lawyer, but as far as I know, it's a worldwide thing.
So isn't there a problem here that although Joe talks about the light touch, not necessarily sort of throwing stuff at it to indicate Jackson's guilt, they sort of took a hands-off approach. There is no other side to it. And
Absolutely.
while the filmmaker might say this isn't about Michael Jackson, it was about Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson's not there. Isn't there a real danger in this?
There is a real danger in this. I think, firstly, in terms of the legal situation, I see that the Michael Jackson estate are trying to shoehorn a claim.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier, 100 million.
Yeah, but into an obscure clause under a contract that was signed totally.
Oh, the 1992 contract.
The 1992 contract. Yeah.
You mustn't ever say anything bad about Michael.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A kind of standard boilerplate contract that would have been in there, which they never thought would be so useful one day as now it is. Sorry, the question.
The question was, it's impossible to libel somebody who's dead, and therefore they have no response whatsoever. And to argue that there is a light touch, and I'm not pinning this one on you, Joe, but to argue that there was a light touch, in other words, we didn't say too much about Michael Jackson. Other people said things. They didn't lard it on.
I think in this instance...
is an easy defence, isn't it?
It is, but I think in this instance it's possibly more excusable given that the defence is there in the form of the 2005 acquittal. So it's kind of like, he was acquitted then, that was his case, and he got off. This is the other side of the story. This is the evidence that wasn't presented back then. So that...
I'm uncomfortable with that.
I mean...
because there was a prosecution and a defence in the original trial, and now what we're seeing is a second prosecution.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with it to the extent that the film doesn't in any way present any reasons as to why he might have been acquitted first time round. One knows that Wade Robson's testimony was very important, but other than that, there's little else in terms of...
Okay, well, let's not concentrate too much on just the Michael Jackson and the other ones that we've mentioned, but where are we going here? Are we slipping into sensationalist TV?
Well, I think the challenge, not necessarily the overriding problem, but certainly the challenge going forward is that documentary makers, I don't know if you'll both agree with me, sit between entertainment providers and journalists. So journalists as print reporters, there's a whole bunch of standards. We go to the lawyers, we go to, there are goalposts. I mean, fewer than there were, now budgets are cut, but at least you go through the chicanes and you finally come out with something that is acceptable and seen as an objective accounting of facts. And entertainment providers are just trying to get viewers bums on seats, cinema tickets sold. And documentary makers want to pursue truth. You have your sword and your crusade, but equally, there's no point making it and getting out of bed unless you can get those bums and those tickets sold. So somehow you need to borrow the kudos of the journalism and succeed in a way that entertainment distributors will be happy with you.
This is for everybody here, but I mean, I'd like to bring you to Phil. Do you reckon you get lawyered up to be certain of the truth or to know what you can get away with?
That's a good question. What I think with regards to the way that I work, so, you know, I'm part of the editorial team at The Economist, and we follow a really rigorous journalistic sort of process and legal process as well.
Let's ask the lawyer.
Yeah.
Do people come to you because they want to be certain that what they're saying is the truth, or because they want to know what they can get away with?
I think it's... I mean, sometimes you'll be approached to basically review an entire documentary for libel, and sometimes you'll be approached after the event. So after they've put allegations to subjects of a documentary and a response has come back, then you'll be consulted as to whether anything needs changing. I think.
I'm sorry to stop you. I asked you before the programme to tell me personal stories about what affected you as a filmmaker. I'm not going to go into that one now. And I asked you to as well, Joe. If you can, briefly, if you wouldn't mind, tell us, and by extension show the people who are watching this, that you actually, there's a story that you were going to mention to me, that it actually affects you making these documentaries. It's not just a business.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, I sort of tackle quite hard-hitting stories about things that affect people all over the world. And I spent some time in a refugee camp on the border of Syria and Jordan, making a variety of different films for The Economist. And, you know, you're parachuted in. You meet these people. You try and tell their stories in a limited period of time, because that's how long you're there on the ground. That's how long your budget allows you to. And then you sort of pack your bags and leave. And I think for me, the window into a world of these people's worlds of suffering, really difficult situations where they've been, had to flee their country, lost families, because of a terrible war that's happening. That is a really difficult thing to do, is to leave and then sort of move on to the next story. But that's kind of what you have to do as a filmmaker.
And yet, in its own way, that story, although it probably affects you, is an easier story to tell, because there is no doubting that they are refugees. The difficulty comes when there are grey areas.
But you have to interrogate those individuals as well. I did a story about a South Sudanese child soldier who's now a hip hop star, and he's a child soldier 15 years ago. You have to corroborate that evidence. That was quite a difficult conversation to have with him about what he was saying, and trying to interrogate it, and then find other bits of evidence to corroborate that as well.
Look, I know we could carry on talking for a great deal more, but I hope if you're watching this, you're wondering how the truth gets out there on TV. You understand a little bit more about it now. Next time you sit down to watch something that says, this is actually what happened. From me, David Foster, from my guests, thank you for watching. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye for now.